Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I ask you to please take your seats and to thank you for your patience with us this fine evening. I think we will begin, and we do have our apologies. There was a little mix-up, but I'm very pleased that we could all be together. Representatives of the diplomatic missions to Barbados, Sir Trevor Carmichael, President of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, Mr. Metzgen and Mrs. Metzgen, our distinguished speakers tonight, distinguished guests, devoted members, ladies and gentlemen. This evening, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society is especially pleased and privileged to join in commemoration of the centenary of the eve of the First World War with this special event. We take special pleasure in welcoming this evening's speaker and former Museum Council member, Mr. Humphrey Metzgen, whose presentation tonight, Caribbean Memories of the First World War, 1914 to 18, marks the launch of what we intend to be the museum's multi-year program to document and commemorate the role the West Indies played in the First World War. The First World War was effectively the world's first truly global conflict in that it impacted, involved, and encompassed the entire world in a deadly conflict which cost the lives of nearly 15 million persons and dismantled 3 global empires in the process. Britain's empire played an essential role in the deliverance of victory over the Axis forces, but the role that men and women of the colonies played has, to all intents and purposes, been largely forgotten and undervalued by today's public. There are many different histories, many different perspectives, which can be used to enter this highly pivotal, tragic, but in times heroic period. But tonight's focus is on the Caribbean. Amongst the large number of colonial troops who spilled into Europe and elsewhere, 16,000 men, and we have yet to know quite how many women, from the British Caribbean labored and fought in the theaters of Egypt, Palestine, Mesopotamia, now Iraq, and supported the front line in France. Their story, the story of the British West Indies Regiment, is a prime example of negligence, marginalization, but the ability to rise above those experiences, and that these troops contributed. Indeed, all extra-European First World War history, really, has been subjected to for 100 years. Humphrey Metzgen's lecture will highlight for us the contribution of these persons and their fight for the right to fight. This, coupled with our recently refurbished and reopened Talma Gallery, will, we hope, help all Barbadians to understand our part in this great war and the changes it wrought within our community as a result. Above all, we hope to ensure with this our first program to address this history which haunts us, and by so doing helps us to recover our lost memories of those men and women who served faithfully and well, and to identify the legacies and lessons learned as a result. It is, ladies and gentlemen, my special pleasure to welcome to the podium our President, Sir Trevor Carmichael, who will introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Sir Trevor, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Director. Distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, our distinguished speaker, Mrs. Metzgen, I've been asked to say a few words tonight of introduction, and indeed I shall do so, but to speak about Mr. Metzgen here at the museum would be very much, I don't want to say taking Coast and Castle, let me say it would be very much like taking molasses to buckwheat. He is very much a product of the museum, speaking in terms of the last, I say product only in terms of the last few years, because he's the product of many, many, many places. And his extended biography is in the program, and I shan't read it because we are all here literate, otherwise we wouldn't be at the lecture. So it's all there for you to read. But what I will say is that his presence here at the museum in the last 15 years or so has been monumental. It has been monumental in terms of what he has done for the reforming of the museum's finances, and indeed the development path which the museum has embarked upon financially and indeed developmentally. So he's not just a reformer, but as you will see tonight, he's also a reader. He's a gentleman and he's a scholar. And he's many other things. But he's given the lecture tonight, and I'm not, and I shouldn't stay here too long. But one thing I noticed, which piqued my interest about the war, just last week when I was reading a paper in the UK, and a young man had been sentenced for desecrating a monument. It led me to do a little work which I haven't had the opportunity to discuss with Humphrey, but I'm sure he would be able to tell me more about it. But in terms of the 250,000 young people who actually sought to enlist in the First World War, and apparently many of those 250,000 people were underage, and recruiting sergeants were paid 2 shillings and 6pence for everyone who enlisted following the outbreak. And at that time you had a minimum height of being only 5'3". So you can imagine it was very easy for the taller teenagers to lie about their ages. But they were lying in a good cause. And the youngest killed in action is believed to have been Private John Condon, who was only 12 when he lied about his age to recruiters in Waterford, Ireland. And unfortunately he died 2 years later. So, when you look at the analysis of the First World War casualty records from one regiment, it was found that 1 in 8 persons were killed when they were 19, and that was the most dangerous age, but 4% were 18 or under. This is just really to give you a sense of the commitment in this war, and looking at it in the European theatre. Tonight Humphrey is going to, this is just a snippet, Humphrey is going to take you and give you all the dimensions of this important war. And I have had the opportunity to hear him speak on other military matters in a formal sense and informal sense. And he's a riveted speaker. He's very knowledgeable of the subject, and we're really in store here tonight for a big treat. And I'm so glad that he has honored us with his presence tonight. It's over to you, Rob.
Yes, I think the technology is working. I can just about hear myself, I think. Hello and good evening, everyone, especially to the many veterans here tonight. May I also give a very special thanks to the Barbados Museum for organising this evening. I must also congratulate them on the selection of this venue to mark Armistice Day. It is a perfect setting to remind us of the ultimate sacrifice made by many on the battlefields of Europe during World War I. Our venue is also a timely reminder of the military life in the Caribbean before and during the Great War. Armistice Day, however, is not only a period of military medals, poppies and church parades. It is also part of our 20th century history that has touched most families in the last 100 years, whether they lived in the tranquility of the Caribbean or the vast terrains of Russia and Europe. The events of World War I has become an umbilical cord with our forefathers that have linked every generation. Some might even say they are part of the DNA. Peter Parker, in his book, The Last Veteran, aptly wrote, "The war has become part of who we are. It occupies a disproportionately large place in our sense of the world and its history. The foreign names such as Mons, Epps, Lois, Passchendaele, and songs, which retain a familiarity even for those who could not point to them on a map." The museum has named tonight's lecture in honour of General John Graham and Major Mike Hartman, and it is in the spirit of passing that baton on to the current generation. I knew both these officers. General Graham and I were officers in the Parachute Regiment in the United Kingdom, and he later retired to Barbados with his wife, Rosemary, who is in the audience here tonight. Major Mike, as he was affectionately known, was also a British officer in the Wiltshire Regiment, whose knowledge of the 17th and 18th Caribbean weaponry contributed significantly to our knowledge of naval ships and land fort defences in the region. Thank you, gentlemen. We miss you both. Tonight I have been asked to focus my address not on the battles of World War I, which are well documented, but on the cultural, social and political scene that confronted the Caribbean volunteers as well as the British public during the period 1914 to 18. High on that agenda were the concerns of arming a black community to fight in a white European war and the implications this had on the British electorate, its soldiers and its European political partners. During this period, few people would have travelled to the colonies, other than British civil servants, plantation owners, and military personnel attached to British regiments. The prospects of working in the Caribbean was not seen as an attractive option for most Europeans. Health issues and the prospects of no further promotion compared with unfavourable postings like, say, India or South Africa. Yet amongst all this, the dominions and the colonies of the British Empire, like the West Indies, as well as the Americans, rallied to Britain's support. And recently, Hugh Stroud, Professor of History and War at All Souls College, Oxford, rightly reminded us the Great War was a global conflict, and in 1914, the British Empire, not Britain, went to war. More than 2 million soldiers from across the empire fought for Britain. The Indian Army alone provided 1 million troops to serve overseas and won 12 Victorian crosses in the course of that war. Let us not forget also that wars are expensive business, and many of our allies contributed funds and materials. The United States taxpayer alone contributed $50 million. World War I is also a story of blunders, disappointments, and misguided territorial ambitions by European powers. Equally, it is a story of change a change from the old to the new order of social, economic and political awakening, especially in the colonies, including the West Indies. World War I may not have initiated democratic change, but it certainly dictated its timing. Given this backdrop, my lecture poses a number of questions. Why did the Caribbean people join this war? What were the challenges and key issues on arrival? What were their contributions, if any? What were Britain's response to all this? And finally, what were the legacies and lessons learned? Initially, it was thought the war would be over in a few months, and many welcomed the call to arms. Lady Jane, the sister of the 10th Earl of Stamford, wrote,
I remembered pretty well August the 4th, 1914. I was in the bathroom upstairs, and my brother shouted through the door with great excitement, "We've declared war on the Germans. War has broken out." It was the most marvellous thing that ever happened, because we had won the Boer War and we were going to mince up the Germans before Christmas. The whole country was thrilled about it and cheered in front of Buckingham Palace. We didn't know what it was going to be like.
It soon became clear that this was not going to be an easy war, if there is such a thing as an easy war, and it would certainly not be over by Christmas as many had thought. The Battle of Mons quickly highlighted this, and again in the Battle of the Somme, when British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day. Britain's army was not properly equipped to fight a land war, and the army was much too small in numbers to make any significant gains. A cry went out for help, and as expected, the Dominions, the United States of America, and the colonies responded magnificently with money, raw material, and manpower. This situation was not helped by the political, economic, and social distractions of the time in Britain. However, the cry for overseas aid was not all plain sailing. In the case of the Caribbean troops, for example, they faced difficulties in getting to grips with their new environments. The racism, the management from the War Office, who viewed the Caribbean volunteers as an unnecessary contribution. On the front line, the view was different. World War I was discomfort and fear and exhaustion and having your best friend, quite literally, blown up to pieces in front of your eyes. The civilian population was also experiencing the horrors of war, as was readily told in the letters when Phyllis Kelly first heard of her lover, Eric Appleby, had been seriously wounded. She immediately put pen to paper. She wrote from Dublin on October 28, 1915,
My own darling Englishman, I wonder why I'm writing this, which you may never see. Oh God, perhaps even now you've gone far away from your lady. I wonder when another telegram will come. This knowing nothing is terrible. I don't know what to do. I've simply sat and shivered with such an awful clutching fear at my heart. Oh, my love, what shall I do? But I must be brave and believe all will be well, dear one. Surely God won't take you from me now. It'll be the end of everything that matters. You are all the world and the life to me. The letter was never posted. Eric was already dead.
By the end of World War I, over 9 million soldiers had been killed, and another 21 million had suffered. Over 1 million soldiers were either wounded or killed during the infamous Battle of the Somme. Clearly, this was not good news. And in addition, in 1916, we saw a change in political leadership. The House of Commons lost confidence in H.H. Asquith, the British Prime Minister at the time. Wartime disasters in Gallipoli and the Western Front and the uprising in Ireland combining to make this downfall inevitable. At the end of the war, the certainties of the old order was collapsing, was one the empire could not avoid. The impact of the Russian Revolution in 1917 was immediate. with leaders in Britain worried that the dangerous ideas of communism might take hold in the country. And if that was not enough, by the end of the war, the world was struck with the Spanish flu, killing 50 million people. It was, by any imagination, a period of uncertainty that was to touch and change the social and political landscape of Britain forever. To understand the impact of World War I in the Caribbean, I need to take you back to the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of that period, the empire covered more than 11 million square miles of territory and included India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, now known as Zambia, Hong Kong, Gibraltar, and several islands in the West Indies and various colonies in the African coast. By 1910, the King, Edward VII, reigned over 410 million people. In population terms, that is bigger than the United States. As this might seem wonderful, but it certainly became clear that it was not sustainable in the long term. Furthermore, there were major socio-economic challenges on the home front that caused concern. The average weekly wage in Britain was the equivalent of £1.40. Life expectancy for women was 54 years of age, 50 for men. The richest 1% of the population controlled 70% of the nation's wealth. Could you imagine that today? A pint of beer cost twopence. 1 in 20 people immigrated in search of a better life. Just 6% of children were at school at 16. Most went to work to support their families. More than 5 million women had jobs, but women did not vote, or did they have a female member of parliament. In Barbados, most of the British Caribbean, life continued as most colonies did, except they discovered early that education was the great social elevator of the masses. A secondary education was helpful in getting into the lower ranks of the bureaucracy and the essentials of entering the professions. A system of scholarships enabled the working classes to move into secondary schools and into the professions unheard of in previous generations. The number was never large, but the stream was constant, and the competition for scholarships was fierce. Studying for these scholarships was more than an individual effort. It was a family enterprise, as it is even today. Moreover, by the early decades of the 20th century, this process of academic selection and rigorous preparation for the British examination was controlled predominantly by black schoolmasters, the foundation of the emerging certificated masses. On the 4th of August 1914, the Prime Minister, A.J. Ascot, declared war in German Empire. The reasons were complex, but most would agree that a mixture of nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the various alliances that were key factors, even though the invasion of Belgium often cited as one of the treaty obligations which caused Britain to declare war. The true reason is that Britain feared that if France was overrun by Germany, its global position as an imperial and maritime power would be threatened. The idea of Germany on British doorsteps across the English Channel was a worry. At the same time, under the 1839 treaty, Britain was obliged to safeguard Belgium's neutrality in the event of an invasion. Britain also had a moral commitment to France. This complex arrangement provided a solution to halt German expansion, but it's also led to disagreement within the cabinet up to the 31st of July. 4 days later, the 4th of August, at 11 a.m., Britain declared war. On the 8th of August, Parliament passed the Defence Realm Act. This gave the government new powers. Some of these included the requisitions of buildings and lands. Other elements of the new law prohibited the discussions of naval and military matters, loitering on the railway bridges, or feeding wild animals, which was considered a waste of food. Coupled with these severe restrictions on movement of people as well as censorship, imposition was also laid on journalism and private communications. Almost anyone could be arrested for causing alarm. Even the practice of whistling for a cab at night was restricted. And certainly the idea of flying a kite or starting a bonfire was not encouraged in cases attracted to zeppelins. Even buying binoculars was out of the question. Discussing military matters in public became a serious offence. Those who breached them with intent to assist the enemy could be sentenced to death. In fact, 10 people were executed under those regulations. The most intrusive powers, however, were directed at women. A woman with VD could be prosecuted for having sexual intercourse with a serviceman. It did not matter that the husband could have been the source of the disease in the first place. The legislators simply took the view that VD caused 416,000 admissions to hospital amongst Britain and the Dominion troops, enough to cause a huge drain on the army resources. In the end, the measure was poorly conceived, and far from helping the situation, it actually hampered morale in Britain. The legislation provoked fierce protest, especially from the suffragettes, but it was not changed until the end of the war. War also saw a move away from the idea of business as usual, to complete state intervention in public affairs. Looming on the horizon, there were also issues on the labour front to be settled. The growing concern of the suffragette movement and the Home Rule for Ireland. The royal family, under George V, resolved their titles with Germany and changed the family name from Saxon-Gothenburg to more British-sounding name of the House of Windsor. By 1916, the war was not going well. The Allies' attacks on Turkey through Gallipoli and Mesopotamia were total failures. Russia and Italy were proving to be weak allies, and the Treasury was running out of money to buy war supplies from the United States. Asquith was replaced by Lord George, who became Prime Minister. There was also still some real issues the government had to resolve. One of the big issues was whether to introduce conscription or seek the help from the colonies and America. The Irish, on their side, had anticipated in return a measure of self-government might follow. This clearly outraged the Irish parties in Westminster, who walked out and returned to Ireland to organise opposition. To make matters more difficult, both Australia and Canada began to raise the issue of national sentiment. They wanted to manage those segments of the war under their control. This issue was put aside until the conclusion of peace. It may well be that this was the first signal that things were not going to be the same after the war, and the breakup of the British Empire might be a consequence. In the Caribbean, the news of war was greeted with patriotic praise. Barbados and others sent encouraging telegrams of overwhelming support, as well as funds and commodities to fight the war. Many of the islands donated sugar and, of course, rum, which was extensively drunk by both the Navy and the Army. It's interesting to note that many of this was gulped down, for instance, by thousands of infantry men before they left their trenches to attack the Germans on the front. Raw materials such as arrowroot and cottonwood were also sent. Locally, half cocoa was made into chocolates and shipped to the troops in decorative tins that bore a message typifying the spirit of the time. The gifts of the colonies of Trinidad and Grenada and St. Lucia to His Majesty's Navy and military forces. On a more impressive level, The islands also paid for 9 aircraft for the Navy and the Army Air Services. Why was there this enthusiasm, given the remoteness of the conflict and the fact that the German aggression was not relevant to the West Indies? One of the answers is years of history had led West Indian people to view themselves as part of the British Empire and to take a degree of pride in membership of the family. The war, a more significant event than any West Indian had yet experienced, presented the image of the mother country in peril. The economic, political and social system which they had grown up was threatened by a largely unknown and an apparent aggressive European power. The reality of distress, reinforced by the relentless patriotic press, was sufficient for many to set aside, at least temporarily, peacetime preoccupation with poverty. Domestic political considerations were considered to be quick or shelved for the duration. Interestingly, the same was true for other parts of the empire. In Ireland, for example, where civil war between the Protestants and the Catholics had been expected to break out at any moment, the two sides postponed their quarrel, at least until Easter 1916. In Britain itself, the civil disobedience campaign by the suffragettes to win vote was similarly put in abeyance until the return of peace. Though this feeling was not the last in the West Indies, it gave some impetus to the colonies. For others, the war presented an opportunity to advance the cause by demonstrating the worth of the black people. It enabled colonial subjects to prove their loyalty to the empire, to show patriotism, ability, self-sacrifice equal to that of the British, and to impress the white establishment. In some ways, women earned the right to vote through the wartime jobs they carried out. The Federalists in Barbados, traditionally the most conservative British of the island, made this point in an editorial.
As coloured people, we will be fighting to prove to Great Britain that we are not so vastly inferior to the whites that we should not be put on a level, at least, of political equality with them. We will be fighting to prove that the distinction between God-made creatures of one empire because of skin, colour or complexion differences should no longer exist, and that some opportunities should be afforded the coloured subjects of the empire as full by right of race to its citizens. We will be fighting to prove that we are no longer merely subjects, but citizens, citizens of a world empire whose watchword should be liberty, equality and brotherhood.
Despite competition amongst the island to demonstrate enthusiasm to the British cause, it was also imagined that by these idealists that the war would create a common sense of identity. Another publication, West Indian newspaper in Grenada, advised the people of the region
they should first learn to cultivate the spirit of regionality, to look beyond their cocoa fields and cane fields into the broader outlook of West Indian interests. The war that is being waged in Europe today affords to the world a great object lesson in unity and self-sacrifice. Let us hope that West Indians, as represented in these scattered islands of the Caribbean, will have long abandoned their mutual suspicions, prejudice and reservations of pride, and be quite prepared to enter into a spirit of oneness and purpose.
There was not, however, a rush to enlist as there was in Britain or in the White Dominions. The conflict was too far away, the number of potential recruits too small for the War Office in London to immediately raise the new West Indians units. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914, the conflict was expected to be, as is often repeated phrase, had it over by Christmas. There would be no time to train recruits in a distant part of the empire and transport them across the Atlantic. There seemed no point in bringing such soldiers to a thoroughly unfamiliar environment to fight an enemy that was undoubtedly better trained and better acclimatized than they were. Britain possessed the world's largest navy, and this was expected to play the major role in defending the British Isles and the colonies. There was also an excellent but small regular army and a territorial force. With the outbreak of war, government policy was that some territorials would be sent to take over the garrison duty in India and other colonies in order to release the regular units to serve in Europe. In addition, several overseas territories, Canada, Australia, especially India, had regiments of regular soldiers of their own, which would be dispatched to the conflict areas immediately. In all these places, however, there was also volunteers of military service, and they would be accepted for service before the War Office needed to consider West Indians as soldiers. Race was undoubtedly a significant factor. In both Britain and Europe, there had been suspicions on the part of a small but influential white interest towards the notion of arming blacks in masses. It was felt that by this element, that training a large number of them in the use of weapons could store up trouble for the future, that their loyalty could not be relied upon, and to transport them to a greater expense to other parts of the world might give them dangerous political ideas. It was argued too that the islands could not afford the loss of a significant proportion of their manpower without affecting the production of raw material, especially for the war effort. These were also the issues that blacks might be killing whites, a concept that at the time was unacceptable to international public opinion. There was also the belief that the colonies would be considered neutral territory in the event of war. This notion, in practice, is ignored by both sides. British and the imperial troops, including the West Indians, at once invaded Germany's African possessions in Togo, Cameroon, and Southwest Africa. In Tanganyika, on the other side of the continent, German forces put up much fiercer resistance. African German troops fought against white, colour and black allied forces, while black units were fielded by both sides in this fighting. There was a reluctance amongst the belligerents to use troops of colour in Europe. The Germans' treatment of their own black colony subject was often harsh. This was well known throughout the world. Though professional Indian troops were used in France and the Flanders early on in the war, it was gradually, as losses in Europe manpower became more severe, that the Allies began to send colonial troops into the trenches of the Western Front. First to do so were the French, who brought in North African troops, as they had done half a century earlier with the Franco-Prussian War. Clearly, in these circumstances, there was little opportunity or incentive for West Indians to volunteer for war service, even though the conflict did briefly impinge on their region. The War Office initially argued that the West Indian soldiers would be needed for defense of their own islands. As the war widened, it was urged that they should be sent to Egypt to fight the Turks or used in garrisons in West African territories captured from Germany. The War Office, however, proved indecisive, and both they and the Colonial Office insisted that the matter should be resolved by the other. Meanwhile, public opinion in the Caribbean was growing increasingly restive and demanded to know why the services of its young men were being rejected. King George V, who favoured the West Indies, prodded the War Office into action, and the Secretary of State, Lord Kitchener, agreed to raise the West Indian contingent, in addition to the already existing West Indian Regiment. The London Gazette announced that
His Majesty the King has been graciously pleased to approve the foundation of a corps from contingents of the inhabitants of the West India Islands to be entitled the British West Indies Regiment, the BWIR.
Recruiting of this new force began in the autumn of 1915. The first batch of men from Jamaica and British Honduras, which is now Belize, set off for the United Kingdom a few months later. Others made their own way occasionally to experience a different reception. On arrival in England, volunteers were quarantined into temporary camps at Seaford in Sussex and Wintnow near Plymouth. They were greeted by an intrigued British public with excitement, curiosity and warmth. But this welcome was to be their only experience of warmth. They had arrived in the midst of winter, and many fell ill at once. Their camps were not properly heated, and frostbite claimed a number of casualties, as did measles. A similar fate befell the third contingent, which left Jamaica in March 1916. It sailed from north to Halifax to cross the North Atlantic, but by the time their unheated ship reached Nova Scotia, more than 600 men had frostbite. 5 died, and over 100 had to have amputations. The victims of what came to be known as the Halifax incident were returned to Jamaica 3 months later as invalids, only to find that the pension which they were entitled were delayed. The matter was extensively covered in the local press and caused such uproar that recruitment had to be suspended. By this time, volunteering for war service had lost some of its appeal. After 2 years of fighting, there seemed no prospects that the Germans would be defeated soon. There was also no disguising the setbacks the Allies had suffered, such as in the Gallipoli campaign. Moreover, a single significant number of young men saw no point in volunteering for the services overseas. No black West Indian at the time could become an officer. The highest rank most could achieve was warrant officer. Educated blacks therefore faced limited options, while qualified whites could expect to be commissioned more or less automatically. The West Indian situation was not helped by the judges and magistrates of the day in Britain, passing sentence on petty criminals to either serve in the army or go to prison instead. Not surprisingly, this practice might have filled the ranks, but it also meant that a lower standard of black recruitment began to join the contingent. Even when this was not the case, the manual of military law at the time classified black people as aliens, even those that were British subjects. Only 1 in every British subject would be enlisted. This meant many were turned down by recruitment officers. There were, however, rare exceptions, and Walter Towell was one of them. He was a black professional footballer who played in Britain for Tottenham Hotspur and later enlisted in the army in 1909. He became the first black officer in the British Army to lead white troops into battle in the First World War and was killed at the Somme in 1918. Walter Towell, the son of a joiner, was born in Folkestone in April 1888. Walter's father, the son of a slave, had arrived from Barbados in 1876. In 1895, when Walter was 7, his mother died. Walter's father remarried, but he died 2 years later. The stepmother was unable to cope with all 6 children, and Walter and his brother Edward were sent to the Methodist-run orphanage in Bethnal Green in London. After nearly a century of being unknown, the Towell life story is about to become a movie. Shooting of the film will begin next year with a release planned for July 2016 to coincide with the centenary of the Battle of the Somme. The Royal Mint in Britain has also recognised Towell's legacy by making him the subject of a £5 coin to commemorate the First World War. Dr. Clacy, the director of the Royal Mint Museum, said Towell was chosen as an example of the great bravery of ordinary people who went on to perform extraordinary acts. This policy of segregation was not limited to Britain alone. The United States did not grant Native American citizens until 1924, and nearly 13,000 of them had served in World War I. Eventually, 11 battalions of the British West Indies was raised, and they were split between several fronts. A total of 397 officers and 15,000 other ranks served in the British West Indies Regiment. The number of men per colony is as shown on the slide to my right. The interesting figure here is Barbados and St. Vincent, being two very small islands in the Caribbean, who in total contributed well over 1,000 and something like nearly 7% of the total mass that was required. 2 battalions went to France, and 1 unit was sent to East Africa where the climate was affecting white troops. Another 100 went to Mesopotamia as part of the Indian Expedition Force, but the main force was posted to Egypt, where strategically vital Suez Canal was threatened by the Turks. A similar situation occurred in the United States. Only 11% of black recruits were in combat force. The rest were put in labour units, loading cargo, building roads, digging trenches. They served in segregated divisions, the 92nd and 93rd, and trained separately. At Basra in Mesopotamia, West Indian skills in boat handling was used to good effect in the transporting of troops and supplies. But it was the units in Egypt expeditionary forces that made best use and contributed significantly to the war. In November 1916, it was decided by a conference in Cairo that owing to the continuing shortage of men, the West Indians would be used in combat. The threat of Turkish invasion was acute, and all members of the Egyptian forces were trained extensively in attack and defense. The West Indians were at last given an opportunity to show their mettle, and when fighting began, the West Indians became involved in one of the war's most decisive and successful campaigns. This was on the General Allenby offensive in Palestine, in which the West Indians pursued the Turks across the Sinai Desert, through the Jordan Valley and into Syria. Here, West Indian troops earned the praise of those who commanded them. Major General Chalker, who commanded the Australian and New Zealand troops in Palestine, sent this message to the regiment.
You showed great keenness in reconnaissance. Indeed, all the troops of my division report that they like to fight alongside you. In fact, they could never wish for anybody better. He went on. The bearing of these 2 battalions was excellent throughout. In the trenches, their discipline was of a high standard, and great enterprise was displayed by their patrols. They displayed great steadfastness under fire and dash in the attack, and gave proof of marching power of a high order.
Tribute was also paid to West Indians who served in East Africa. An officer who observed them wrote,
When the conditions seemed most hopeless, they never seemed to give in, and the saving grace of humour seemed always to be present. On a patrol, when everyone had to sleep in the pouring rain, when too tired to march any further, the only comment was, "Serve me right for me fastness to join contingent. When I get home, I'll be afraid even to join a church."
These testimonials were praised indeed, but there were to be the British West Indies realm and the reward. Though the battles in the Middle East had proved that they could fight as well as any imperial troops, the War Office had already decided that all future contingents arriving in the Caribbean would be sent as labourers to the Western Front. In April 1917, Jamaica introduced conscription, and the flow of the men was now steady. What these recruits found on reaching England, or the battlefronts, was boredom, frustration and discrimination. As before, many arrived ill or quickly became so in an unfamiliar climate. They were housed in primitive camps and subject to military discipline, but had no effective outlet for their energies. In addition, they were excluded from pay increases given to other Empire troops, and were often barred from using the recreation facilities available to the rest of the army. At the end of the conflict, the battalions of the West Indian Regiment were reunited in Toronto in southern Italy. Part of the regiment had been there for some time loading the supplies that were sent to the Allied forces in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now they were all confined in a camp and being used as dock workers. Many of them had no leave since enlisting up to 3 years earlier, and with the war over, they saw white troops being demobilized and sent home ahead of them. By the beginning of December 1918, they had enough. A mutiny broke out. The trouble lasted 4 days and had to be put down by British troops. The men refused to work as they were attacks on officers. They demanded the inclusion of white officers, though this was not possible because there were no black officers. All the indignities that the West Indian soldiers felt had suffered over a period of years found expression in this mutiny. It was not unique. Canadian soldiers camped in Scotland also rioted because they were not being sent home fast enough. White Imperial troops also felt belittled and by haunted attitude in the War Office, as did some British troops held in Boulogne in France the following year. A significant outcome of the incident of Toronto was the formation of the political group called the Caribbean Forum. One of its leading members was Clement Whitman from Barbados, who wrote in the press about his experience. Nowhere were their grievances of black troops more fervently discussed than in the sergeant's message, which could be found to be the most educated and politically aware black soldiers. Though they were able to do little more than talk, the members formulated many ideas regarding the future of their region, the social and political rights of blacks, and the possibility of unification of the British Caribbean territories. Toronto proved to be a sort of political university for a generation of West Indian intellectuals and influenced the thinking of many servicemen once they had returned home. The ugly mood that sparked Toronto mutiny continued to be evident throughout the following year, as shiploads of West Indian servicemen were repatriated. They continued to resent the treatment they had received and continued to agitate for the pay increase that they were still denied. Many spent time in England prior to sailing for the Caribbean, and they had experienced an unpleasant upsurge in racial violence. With the conflict over and unemployment now high, Britain did not want foreign people of any sort taking work from their own people. The West Indians, whose arrival at the wartime allies had intrigued the British population, were often now taunted and attacked in British ports and cities. As always, these incidents were reported in newspapers in the Caribbean. The mutiny at Toronto was not, however, limited to troops of West Indies. There were similar difficulties amongst the British, Indian, French and Americans. There were the Cara mutiny in Ireland, the British troops protesting against the enforcement of the Home Rule. The Singapore mutiny by Indian soldiers against the British. The Étretat mutiny in the British troops in France. The French army mutinied about the failure of the Nivelle offensive in April and May of that year. The Hudson riots, where 156 American soldiers seized weapons and attempted to march on the city of Houston. The Southampton mutiny by the British army, about to be demoralized, were ordered on board a ship to return to France. By the summer of 1919, when the largest number of British West Indian veterans sailed for the Caribbean, there was very little left of the loyalty to the Empire that had been evident at the outbreak of the war. When a ship brought Jamaican soldiers home, they found a crowd gathered to welcome them, but there were also British warships standing by in case of trouble. The authorities were fully aware of the climate feeling at the time of war, but could not decide whether to treat the men as returning heroes or potential insurgents. There were several riots in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Belize, in which the contingent of men took part. Often these gatherings were spontaneous, but some were deliberately planned, resulting in mayhem. In Britain, the main discontentment in the army was the slow pace of demobilization, which often led to a long and frustrated wait. The problem was that those with key skills were the first to be demobilized, even though they were the last to be sent to serve at the front. The argument was, those with skills were needed to rebuild new industries. This meant that those who were last in were often the first out. Guy Chapman remembers the anger it came when the first person from his battalion to be demobbed was a man who had only served 14 weeks service. He was a minor and therefore needed back in England. Under pressure, the scheme was eventually abandoned. The worst, most prolonged mutiny took place in Calais on the 1st of January 1919 and was a direct result of the men's impatience at the slow pace of demobilization. Private John Patling from the Royal Ordnance Corps had been arrested and imprisoned for making a rebellious remark to his fellow soldiers, some of whom helped him to escape. When Patling was rearrested, 2,000 troops failed to answer Rivali, and an equal number from the neighbouring camp joined the contingent in marching to government headquarters to demand the release of the troublesome private. General Bain, a seasoned soldier who had led the Third Army to victory the previous year, was sent to Calais to put an end to the disturbances. But this troop simply joined the mutineers. In the end, further concessions were granted, and on the 31st of January, the mutiny came to an end. Such behaviour was not confined to troops abroad. While General Bain was dealing with the Royal Ordnance Corps problems in Calais, General Trenchard had been sent to quell a disturbance at Southampton, where 20,000 soldiers had mutinied and taken over the docks. He surrounded the unarmed mutineers, who were perhaps aware of Trenchard's reputation for ruthlessness, and called the action off. Further mutinies by soldiers awaiting demobilization took place in Shoreham, Dover, Folkestone, Bristol, Sydenham, Aldershot, by the Army Service Corps, who had learned that they would be the last to be demobilized. Growing unemployment and housing shortage did not help the situation. By 1918, even the police in Britain went on strike, triggered by the sacking of a senior police officer who had been active in his union, which claimed to have 10,000 members and demanded proper recognition. The entire police force of London went on strike on the 30th of August. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister at the time, refused to meet their demands, while the country was at war. By the time of armistice, the Union membership had grown to 50,000. At the outbreak of World War I, few forecast the revolutionary changes that were to come. These include political outcomes like the Treaty of Versailles, or the decline of European power, the democratic states taking over the place of the monarchs, and the rise of communism and fascism. There was also economic consequences, including the economic deterioration of Europe and the rise of the United States of America as a global economic power. Between 1914 and 1919, America increased its share of trade by 100%, largely due to the economic opportunities the war had created. China and India, who historically obtained their supplies from Europe, were now unable to do so because of the distribution and disruption at the time. Coal, for example, was high on the shopping list. An interesting twist here, Britain during the war had moved from the coal industry to the oil in order to support its armed forces. especially the Royal Navy and Task Force on a worldwide basis. Coal was thought to be most poor substitute to bulky. This decision subsequently opened the Middle East oil wells and for Britain to gain a strong presence in the region for many years. An interesting spin in the history we now have today. On the banking front, the American economy continued to grow in confidence with the prospects of repaying loans. In Britain, the Fabian grew more influential, as did the British Labour Party in British politics. The experience of both the Boer War and World War I strengthened the anti-imperialism within Britain and weakened Britain's faith in its ability to rule far-flung colonies of diverse peoples. There was even less enthusiasm for colonial domination when the administrative costs exceeded the economic returns. Even a policy of open management with the publication of a number of government reports, blue books, on each colony did not help the situation. By 1930, it became clear that talking about West India's problems was not the same as doing something about them. 10 years later, 1940, the British Parliament passed the Colonial Development Welfare Act, the first foreign assistance program legislated specifically for the islands. Immediately after the war, Britain introduced votes for women over the age of 30. And 2 years later, the 19th Amendment granted American women the vote. What was clear is that after the war, Britain's leadership in the economy had declined substantially. It had huge debts, high unemployment, and slow growth. France suffered as well. Most of the loans it had made to Kaiser Russia was never repaid. Inflation was rampant, and large part of the country was in ruin. In addition, 4 empires had collapsed: the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian. On the other side of the pond, the war experience left a number of West Indians critical of the British government and British society. Some agitated for political reforms to bring self-government to the Caribbean colonies. This group laid the groundwork for the generation of politicians who later dismantled colonialism in the British Caribbean. Norman Manley, Alexander Busman in Jamaica, Robert Bradshaw in St. Kitts, Bear Bird Sr. in Antigua, Eric Matthews, Gary in Grenada, Granty Adams in Barbados, Hugh Roy Butler, Albert Grooms, and Eric Williams in Trinidad. The colonial government had placed its faith in sugar and large plantations, but sugar was not doing well economically. Increased production in Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad could not mask the difficulty of price and marketing. Unemployment was rife. Wages on sugar estates was 1/4 to 1/2 of those paid on Cuban sugar estates during the same period. Many of the smaller islands had abandoned sugar productions altogether. Not surprisingly, large numbers of the West Indians immigrated for economic reasons to Venezuela, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cuba, Mexico, and the United States. When economic opportunities were ended with the Great Depression, the discontent of the returning miners and frustrated laborers erupted in violence throughout the region during the period 1935 to 1937. Here are some interesting other snapshots during World War I. A Barbadian phrase was added to the English vocabulary: the landship. This was the word given to describe the armoured vehicle military tanks. Whether this was the result of any Barbadian influence is, of course, open to conjecture. What is not in doubt, however, is that the Treaty of Versailles required Germany to pay $33 million in compensations to the Allies for the damage caused. Russia was transformed into the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR. The United States became the largest military power in the world. The Great War brought about the formation of the League of Nations, which led to the groundwork of the United Nations as we know it today. For the West Indians, perhaps the most important outcome of World War was the birth of various political movements that in the long term led to self-governance and independence. In 1646, John Lilburne, writing about freeman's freedom, put it simply: an unnatural, irrational, sinful, wicked, unjust, devilish, tyrannical it is for any man whatsoever to appropriate and assume unto himself power, authority, and jurisdiction to rule, govern, and reign over any sort in the world without their free consent. In 1918, this freedom came with a heavy cost. Germany and its allies lost 6 million service personnel. British lost about 4 million. In addition, there were 35 million civilians and soldier casualties who were wounded. And if this was not enough, the same year, the Spanish flu pandemic quickly killed a further 50 million people around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is right that we are here to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We should remember also that they were those who survived, and we owe them an equal debt. In 1930, Arthur Mee, a British historian, discovered something remarkable about World War I and the people in England. He noticed that there were villages in England who had sent men to that war, and all had returned safely. Mee identified 32 such thankful villages. To the mothers, fathers, grandparents, and veterans, a very special thanks for making it all possible for us to be here today. As is said, at very many solemn moments, we will remember them. In this spirit, I also wish to single out someone in our audience. He's the grandson of one of those who suffered from the flu epidemic. His grandfather was quarantined in Garrison and fell in love and eventually married the lady who nursed him. Today, we are fortunate in welcoming the grandson, Mr. Miguel Painter, who is also the assistant historian curator of the museum. In a way, Miguel's grandfather has answered one of our biggest questions. What were the legacies? I put it to you, it is their children and their children, children. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I guess Mr. Metzgen has introduced me already. Thank you for being here this evening. We also want to welcome all of our dignitaries. Yes, my name is Miguel Pena. I'm the Assistant Curator of History at the Barbados Museum, and I have the distinct privilege this evening of giving the vote of thanks. The notion of a lecture to commemorate the centenary of the First World War really evolved, I would say, about a year ago. And it was inspired by two gentlemen, the late General John Graham, and we're very fortunate this evening to have his widow, Mrs. Rosemary Green, in the audience with us. Thank you so much for being here, ma'am. And of course, and I had the privilege of meeting General Graham about 3 years ago when I was doing some research on the Second World War, and of course he was a veteran of that conflict. And of course, Mr. Humphrey Metzgen, former council member of the Barbados Museum. Both General Graham and Mr. Metzgen co-authored a wonderful book, Caribbean War Stories Untold, A Salute to the British West Indies, which details the military heritage of the English-speaking Caribbean. And while I was doing this research, I was reading the chapter on the First World War, and I thought to myself, there is no other person better suited to actually present a lecture than Mr. Humphrey Metzgen, who, for me, has evolved from Mr. Metzgen to Humphrey to H in our recent communications. I would like to tell all of you that though this lecture has gone on for an hour, it has been in preparations for a year. Mr. Metzgen, Humphrey, started researching, I believe, about 8 months ago, and this research also involved visiting the Imperial War Museum, numerous libraries in the United Kingdom as well as in the Caribbean, archives, and I just wanted to say what an amazing job. A few days ago, he was coming into contact with me more frequently as the time drew closer to the lecture. And I thought to myself, this gentleman spent part of his life jumping out of perfectly sound aircraft as a paratrooper. And I thought, could this be nerves? But as I'm sure all of you would have recognized from this evening's presentation, no, it was not nerves. It is simply passion. It is a passion that Mr. Metzgen has for the history of the Caribbean, but especially its military history. And I would like all of you, please, to put your hands together for this gentleman, this officer. Thank you. Mr. Metzgen, thank you very much. And by no means to be omitted, his wife, Mrs. Metzgen, Julie, who narrated some wonderful excerpts and really helped to add feminine touch to the lecture. Really good. Thank you, Mr. Metzgen. Yes, of course, we also have to thank some of our sponsors in this event. Certainly, you're going to see there's some camera people around, the Barbados Government Information Service. And during the presentation, you saw numerous images which would have been provided by the Imperial War Museum. And if you go home, when you go home tonight, please go online, take a look at what the Imperial War Museum has been doing to commemorate this centenary. And you're going to see numerous photographs that have been made available to the public. Many of them feature West Indians. And this is probably one of the first times you're actually seeing such a public recognition of the Caribbean contribution to this effort. Sorry? Right, and the director is reminding me of some more housekeeping. Over the next 3.5 years, the Barbados Museum is going to be embarking on an oral history project. We have also received, one of our major sponsors would be the British High Commission. Acting High Commissioner, thank you for being here. The museum was awarded some funds to conduct an oral history project, which is going to commence in mid-November and go until March 2015, I beg your pardon. I'm going back a century. 2015. And in this project, what we want to do is speak to the descendants of persons who were veterans of the First World War. Of course, all of the veterans of that conflict are now deceased, as far as we know. We want to speak to the children and the grandchildren. We want to get those stories. We want to get those oral histories so that we can document them and we can put them into the development of a documentary which can be used as a research tool for students of Caribbean history.